Good afternoon. Thank you, and welcome to Planet Word. My name is Caitlin Miller, and I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs, and we're excited to welcome you to today's event, kicking off our new Language and Liberty program series. This is The Greatest Sentence Ever Written with Walter Isaacson. Now, to offer remarks and introduce our guest, please welcome Planet Word's founder and CEO, Ann Friedman.
Thank you for being here today, coming out of the bitter cold, but we're happy to have you at what will promise to be a very warm discussion. And this is the first program in our Language and Liberty series, which we've put together to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's a monthly program designed to delve into the words of the Declaration and evaluate the progress we've made as a country towards achieving them. We are so fortunate to begin this series with Walter Isaacson discussing his new book, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. Can you imagine a better subject for a program at a language arts museum? One about a book with the word sentence in the title. I can't. It's our dream to bring books and words and civics together in one program, and I think Walter is helping us do just that. Alongside his leadership of Time Magazine, CNN, and the Aspen Institute, and now as a history professor at Tulane, Walter somehow found time to write monumental best-selling biographies of Henry Kissinger, Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and more. I think you could even call this new book a biography too. After all, it's the story behind the birth of a historic phrase and its Enlightenment era ancestors. Making this talk especially germane at Planet Word are Walter's insights into the key role played by Benjamin Franklin, the subject of his 2003 bestseller, and as you might be aware, the namesake of Planet Word's home. Yes, you are sitting right inside the Franklin School with a pediment adorned by a bust of Benjamin Franklin right outside this room. Besides helping craft the sentence that defines our republic, writes Isaacson, Franklin lived its ideals. In Philadelphia, he organized a police department, a fire and street sweeping brigade, a library, a hospital, and a school, making sure the common man was served by the government. As shown just yesterday, when a judge in Texas ordered the release of a detained immigrant 5-year-old boy and his father based on what he said was the government's, quote, ignorance of an American historical document called the Declaration of Independence. We see how alive and powerful those words still are, even 250 years after they were written. And at this time, when we're all thinking about how best we can strengthen, preserve, and defend our grand national experiment, it's instructive to understand the words behind the aspirations laid out in the Declaration and what's still left for us to achieve. That's what we hope our series will do, starting this afternoon with Walter's reflections on the promises, debates, and intentions behind what is undoubtedly the greatest sentence ever written. So please help me in welcoming Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Ann. Oh, hug here. Thank you, Ann. It's wonderful to be here with the Ann Friedman fan club, and especially at Planet Word, because as she said, this book and my talk is not just about a sentence, it's about words in the sentence. Each and every one of those 26 words. because most of you know this sentence almost by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but you've probably not done what this museum is dedicated to do, which is to make you think about the power of words, and in this case, the power of each and every word. It's particularly important to do it now because we're entering the 250th birthday of our nation. And as you may notice, we're not exactly in the mood for a birthday party, but I think if we were to try to bring together this nation based on its common values, we would do it by saying, what is our mission statement? What is it that defines us as a nation? And to me, it's this Declaration of Independence, and most importantly, this sentence that they crafted. Now, in June of 1776, the Continental Congress decided they were probably going to declare independence. And what they did, like any Congress, was they appointed a committee. And they appointed a committee to declare why. It may have been the last time Congress created a really good committee. It had Dr. Franklin on it, John Adams, and Jefferson. And Jefferson gets to write the first draft of this sentence. It's actually in the Library of Congress. You can't really see it because the Librarian of Congress won't let it be displayed. We're having a fight with the Librarian of Congress. We want for July 4th this first draft to be displayed next to the final declaration, because those of us who are supporters of Planet Word and those of us who believe in the power of word believe, unlike perhaps your husband, in the power of editors, and that editors can sometimes make things better. So in trying to do this, I looked at this first draft of the Declaration that Jefferson sends down Market Street to Benjamin Franklin and said, would the good Dr. Franklin, with his infinite wisdom, please make the improvements I know that he can in it. People were indeed much nicer to editors back then. And in that very famous second sentence, we hold these truths. And Jefferson wrote in, we hold these truths to be sacred. And there you see Benjamin Franklin's backslashes that he used as a printer to make edits. The dark backslashes a printer uses, and he writes in self-evident. And his point was that we were trying to create a new type of nation, one whose rights come from rationality and reason, not from the dictates and dogma of a religion. And it goes on that they're endowed with certain rights. And there is John Adams, endowed by their creator with certain rights. So even though it starts by saying rationality and reason, they're doing a balance and showing the role of divine providence and the good Lord in creating our country. It was that type of balance they did because they were scientists. They understood Newton's laws, forces, counterforces, equilibrium, and they wanted to get the balance right. When I was first writing about this, I was doing my Ben Franklin biography in whatever it was, 2003, and I was working at CNN. And one day in the morning meeting, we came in, and somebody said, oh, we have a great subject for Crossfire tonight. I could look around this room and not have to worry, because most of you remember what Crossfire was, or for that matter, what CNN was. It said, Judge Moore in Alabama has put the Ten Commandments on the steps, and there he is, and a federal judge is telling him he has to take the Ten Commandments down because of separation of church and state, and he's not going to do it, so we're going to send in federal marshals, and everybody at CNN's table was saying, oh, great, wonderful Crossfire. Who's going to be for the Ten Commandments? Who's going to be against the Ten Commandments? And there I am thinking, as I go back to work that night at 9 o'clock when Larry King came on, I didn't have to watch anymore. I'd work on my book, and I'd say, here we were as journalists using the Ten Commandments, of all things, to divide us. And those politicians using the Ten Commandments to divide us. And of course, there were our founders striking that balance, understanding it's a balance, and that things like religion should not be used to divide us, but to unite us. As I said, they understood the role of science. That's Jefferson with the bust of Franklin there. Franklin, we think of him as a doddering dude flying a kite in the rain, but those electricity experiments are the most important science experiments of the time, and they show equilibrium, balance, plus, minus, forces, reactions, and balances of power. That's what they bring in with the Enlightenment, that understanding that, like Newton, we have to balance things. And they end up creating what I think is this mission statement, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so after looking at the first draft and looking at the edits and understanding the importance of this sentence, I said, I really think we should go word by word, as if we were at Planet Word, to see what they mean, because these truths became the defining creed of our nation, and it became the common ground that created the American dream, taking a diverse group of pilgrims and immigrants and uniting them together. And so I was hoping that just as happened when I was younger, on the 200th, the bicentennial, we could use something like the Declaration to pull us together. Because when the bicentennial was coming along, the late 1960s, we had just gone through Vietnam. We had just gone through the protests, the Vietnam War protests. We had just gone through the race riots and the assassinations of Kennedys and Kings. And then Gerald Ford rang the Liberty Bell, and we all kind of pulled together for the bicentennial. We had tall ships in our harbors, fireworks in our towns. We had bicentennial moments on every network. And it helped heal the nation after a rough period. We're in a rough period now, and I'm hoping we've got 3 or 4 months to get our act together, that we too can do the 250th as a healing birthday instead of using words and using history to pull ourselves apart. And so I tried to start, as I said, word by word. And of course, you have to begin with the very first word, which is we. The same first word they use 11 years later when they write the Constitution, we the people. It's probably the most profound opening phrase of we the people, because it comes from this notion of a social contract that John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers of the period had come up with, which is that our rights do not descend from the divine right of kings or the sword of conquerors, but instead our rights are the rights of a we, of a social contract that we pull together to make sure that we could come out of what John Locke, out of what Thomas Hobbes, out of what Rousseau called the state of nature. And Hobbes said, in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. It's a war against all and all. But Locke says what we do to get out of that anarchy is agree with others to join a community for living in a secure enjoyment of our properties. And so that's the type of social contract embodied in the word we. Now, you may wonder, what did Franklin mean when he said self-evident truths as opposed to sacred truths? Why did he change it? Now, at first, not being a word person thinking every word, I just thought self-evident was some fancy way of saying obvious. We hold these truths to be obvious. But no, I discovered that Benjamin Franklin in 1775 had spent months up in Scotland, because Franklin was our envoy to Britain at the time, trying to stop the revolution from happening. And he spends time with the greatest English language philosopher of that time, David Hume. And David Hume had just come up with a theory of truths. And that theory of truths was that there were 2 types of truths. There were truths based on evidence and facts, such as London is bigger than Philadelphia, or Planet Word has this number of members, whatever it may be. And those are facts that you go out and find and say, is the statement true? But he said there's certain other statements that are analytic truths, meaning they're self-evident, true by definition. For example, all bachelors are unmarried. If you're going to try to figure out, is Philadelphia smaller than London, you have to count the people in Philadelphia, London, make it. But if you want to figure out, are all bachelors unmarried, you don't have to go around surveying bachelors and say, do you have a wife? It is self-evident that that's the truth. And the reason that that's important is when you say all men are created equal, if you're going around looking, well, no, people aren't all equal. Some are taller, some are smaller, some are more successful, brighter, whatever it may be, better athletes. But it's self-evident that they're all equal coming out of the state of nature because they are all equally part of the social contract. And that's what they meant by the self-evident truths of all are created equal. Then, of course, you have to start asking the tough questions. Say, all men. Well, yeah. Did that mean men in a generic sense, the way the rights of man or the way Plato used the word man? Or did they mean males, and they were excluding females? Well, unfortunately, of course, it's the latter. As Abigail Adams writes to John, remember the ladies. I hope you once had got to hear Cokie Roberts speak. She wrote a wonderful book called Remember the Ladies, and John Adams writes back, I cannot but laugh. We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. So as we celebrate, we have to understand the flaws that are embedded into the DNA of the nation, not only the great common ground by this sentence, but the flaws we had to overcome. And of course, when they did it, they weren't talking about women. And then the biggest of all, the greatest of all things we're still trying to overcome, is when they say all men are created equal, they had 500,000 enslaved people, 1/5 of the population. If you go back to that picture of Thomas Jefferson in that room on Market Street, there's actually a fourth person in the room, Thomas Hemings, 19-year-old enslaved valet of Jefferson, who had brought the writing desk with him, traveled with him from Monticello, his close valet, older sister of Sally Hemings, who will become the mother of Jefferson's children. And so we have to grapple, and we're still grappling with, what did they mean when they said all men are created equal? And did they know that the contradiction? And the answer is yes. Jefferson knew it well. He put a tax on slavery in the first draft of the Declaration, and yet he enslaved 400 people. And people say to me, how could it be? How could that be? And I say, that's what we have to wrestle with as we define our nation, because this sentence was not a description of our nation. It was an aspiration. It was a forcing mechanism. It was sort of the mission statement of what we should try to become. And even Jefferson knew that. As he kept his slaves, he knew that that would have to be forced. And so even Adams, very much against slavery when he's doing that sentence, but he says, even though it's totally repugnant, it's something we can't touch right now. They have to make the compromise. And even Ben Franklin allowed the advertising of slavery in the newspaper that he owned. But he, and this is why words are a narrative, they're not static, during his life, he becomes more and more aware of the problem. Ann and I talked about this 15 years ago when this was the Franklin School, and should it be renamed? And I said, yes, Franklin got it wrong, but part of the narrative of his life is like the narrative of the nation, is to realize how badly we get things wrong. He obviously becomes very anti-slavery, frees all the 2 slaves that he had once working in his print shop, and knows, too, that he has to rectify it. And so at age 80, which back then was actually considered old, he becomes the president for the society promoting the abolition of slavery. So even though that statement, we hold the truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal, has deeply embedded in it a contradiction and a conflict that we're still wrestling with, we can see that wrestling with that, sometimes successfully and sometimes we backslide, as we may be doing. That is part of the narrative of this sentence and the nation. And as I said, it becomes a forcing mechanism, something in science, which means it'll force something to happen. Because 77 years after they write this sentence, Lincoln invokes it at the Battle of Gettysburg Cemetery. And when he says 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal, he's not referring back to the constitutions. He's referring back to this sentence, which was written 77 years before. And what they're doing is consecrating a graveyard in which 7,058 people have been buried by having tried to make that sentence become just a little bit more true. Endowed by the Creator. As I said, John Adams put that in. The interesting thing is, even though people are trying, some people, to grab hold of our founders and saying we're a Christian nation based on Christian nationalism, that's not true. Most of the founders, more than 50% of the people who signed the Declaration, and all three members of the committee were what you would call deists. They believed in sort of a creator, but they did not believe in an interventionist God who meddled and you could pray hard enough that, the Commanders would win a football game or it would not rain on Mardi Gras or whatever. They believed in sort of this idea of an impersonal God, and certainly Jefferson in particular. The famous Jefferson Bible that is in Monticello. He takes a Bible and he cuts out with a razor blade all of the mentions of the miracles of Jesus, but keeps Jesus's moral teachings in. So it's more complex when people say, what do they mean by endowed by their Creator? And then you get to the famous line, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It starts with John Locke, and in all the previous versions, including the Declaration of Rights in Virginia, which was done a month before, it's life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and estates, possessions, that they were trying to protect. Because John Locke believed that in order to have autonomous freedom of individuals, you had to have the right to your own property, and it had to be protected. But Jefferson changes it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what do those words mean? Well, first of all, happiness for Jefferson does not mean, let's have a good Mardi Gras party tonight. What is happiness? It means real self-fulfillment. It means what Plato meant by it. It means leading the good life. And that was the notion that each individual got to decide for herself or himself, what is it that I'm trying to pursue? What mark do I want to mean? What's going to be fulfillment for me? And the reason it's important is that it's a living and breathing phrase. What the pursuit of happiness was in 1776 may be different than 1976 or 2026. It might be different for different individuals, but everybody has the individual and collective rights to define fulfillment in their lives as the way they seem fit. As I said, Virginia Declaration rights and others, they keep emphasizing the notion of property. But Jefferson wants to say, we have to have a more meaningful existence, and that's what's going to be new about this country. When they finally turn it in, Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams, and the other two committee members, they turn it in to John Hancock, who is the president of the convention, and Hancock signs with that wonderful flourish that you can see on the back of cover, John Hancock. He says, with all the forces that are contending to pull us apart, we must all hang together. And Dr. Franklin, a little bit of the comedian, says, yes, indeed, we must all hang together, or most assuredly, we'll hang separately. He knew what would happen if they lost. So what underlies these words, these 26, I will dare say, among the most important words in Planet Word? What underlies it? To me, first of all, it's common ground. That we decided to create a nation not based on the dictates of religion, divine rights of kings, conquerors, but putting things into a common ground, saying these are the values, this is the creed that we share. Common ground was a concept that even John Locke came up with. Because even as he defends private property, he says you're allowed to have private property by taking things out of nature, doing things with your labor, making things, but only where there is enough and is good left in common for others. Now, he is not a democratic socialist like Mamdani. He is the patron of generally conservative private property thoughts. But he emphasizes that you have to have a certain common ground. Now, when I first went to school in Boston, I realized there's Boston Common. There's Cambridge Common. In England, Clapham Common. I thought, okay, it's a nice park, you know, not quite as nice as Central Park, but a nice park. Then I realized, oh, what it was a common. And a common was actually a physical space. In the time of John Locke, the aristocrats owned most of the land. But following John Locke's theory, they created the commons, which was where the commoners, and indeed that's where the word commoner comes from, were allowed to graze their sheep, plant their gardens, bury their dead. And that was because if you're going to justify private property or disparities of wealth, it helps to have buy-in from everybody. So each person realizes that the system can work for them. They aren't going to be left behind. So they create the commons. And not only do they create the commons in terms of property, in terms of a piece of land where you can graze your sheep, they put certain goods and services into the commons. Benjamin Franklin started a leather apron club of the middle-class tradesmen and artisans of the Market Street of Philadelphia. And they said, what else do we put in the commons besides the Philadelphia Common? And they said, well, first of all, you'll be happy to know this, a library. By creating a library that was common ground for everybody, Franklin in his autobiography writes, it means that every working person, every tradesman in Philadelphia and all of their children can be just as educated as the best in England. And so they decide library should be in the commons. Then they decide that elementary education. They start the Academy for the Education of Youth. They, of course, decide that a street sweeping corps, a police, night watchman, a police corps, a volunteer fire department. These should not be private things, but it's what we are all going to put into common so that everybody has a stake in society. They even debate. When Franklin started the Volunteer Fire Company of Philadelphia, the rule was you had to always have the bucket by your bedside. When he died 50 years later, his bucket was by his bedside. But they debated, should the fire corps be only for people who pay for it, or should it protect every house, even for people who don't contribute? And of course, they said every house. We're a community. We don't want every third house to burn down. So between the library, pouring forth benefits for the common good is divine, the hospital company, all of the others that they put into commons, that was the way they tried to say a society that will allow the accumulation of private property has to be balanced with making sure there's as good and enough left in common so everybody feels a stake in society. Nowadays, we shut down our government on debates about what should be in the common. Healthcare, they debated it at the Leather Apron Club. They decided to build the hospital company of Philadelphia. They decided to be public-private, half funded by the public legislature, half funded by private donations, serve every citizen. They didn't shut down the government because they couldn't figure out how to do health care. They said it's just a matter of balance of how much do we put in the common. Alexis de Tocqueville is probably the most quoted and least read writer about America. And he writes something that I think is untrue, which is he says there's a great contradiction between America's individualism. People are rugged individuals. There's a contradiction between that and the fact that they're always forming associations. Associations have hospitals and schools and street sweeping corps. I don't think Franklin or the founders or us should think it's a contradiction. It's what we do as a civic society is we all trust our individual rights, but back then you came together for quilting bees, you came together for barn raisings, for volunteer fire departments, just as we come together to create institutions like this, to make sure we have safe streets and safe schools for everybody. That's the core of what we mean by the common ground. In Locke's time, they passed a series of laws called the Enclosure Acts, which allowed some of the common to be enclosed by individuals so they could privately tend it, raise herds there, whatever. That actually was a good thing in some ways. It leads to a greater increase in the total amount of wealth because somebody's responsible for a corner of the commons, they're going to make sure it works. But that enclosure brings up the question we're facing today. What should be private and what should we keep in commons? What I would argue, and I try in this book, is it's a balance, just like they did with that first sentence, that yes, we have medical and education and police and defense and fire in the commons, and we should argue some. Some people would argue we should have much better K through 12 education or more health care or less health care, but we should all remember it's just trying to strike the right balance. These are not existential questions that you have to think somebody is either a communist or a fascist. You just have to say, I get it, I hear you, but I think the balance should be a little bit more on health care. We should try to provide more, or we should provide more police, whatever it may be. Get back to that notion of the age of reason and balance. And the reason that's important is that there is a purpose to the commons. I told you one of the purposes of the commons was when you have private properties and even disparities of wealth, there's a practical purpose to the commons because it keeps people from picking up their pitchforks and wanting to burn down the government because everybody's got a stake in the stability. But there's a deeper purpose to the commons, and that is it forms the foundation for a land of opportunity, the American dream. That's what Franklin says when he does his Planet Word, the library company of Philadelphia, is the moral reason is whatever you may think about the distribution of wealth and property now, we can all agree it should be a land of opportunity where our children all have the opportunity to rise, just as Franklin did, having arrived in Philadelphia with only 3 coins in his pocket and becoming in some ways the richest entrepreneur in America. James Truslow Adams was the one who defined this as the American dream. In a book called The Epic of America in 1931, he said, the American dream is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream in social order in which each man and woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of that which they are innately capable, in other words, their pursuit of happiness, and be recognized for others, whatever their circumstances in life, including, of course, that their children should have more opportunities. And he says as his symbol of what is it. When I talk about the American dream, what's a good symbol of it? It gets back to Planet Word. He talks about the reading room and how there's a reading room which contains all the books, and everybody, rich and poor, laborer and executive and all, are there at libraries provided by the democracy. That's the American dream. Unfortunately, in the past 40 years or so, what has been in the Commons gets more and more nicked away by what you could call the Enclosure Acts. It used to be, as our friend Michael Sandel wrote, that we all went to Fenway Park. We all went to the park, the ball games, and we all went in the same entrances. We ate the same soggy hot dogs. We all drank the bad beer. But now there's special VIP entrances. There's an enclosures. There's private lines. There's private skyboxes. There's velvet ropes for those who are privileged and those who aren't. Even at the airport, which I'm going to right now, so I'm going to be very hypocritical and not complain about it, because in order to make my 4:50 flight to New Orleans, I'm going to take the TSA pre-clear line. I'm going to be part of it, but I'm going to at least be conscious of my privilege, which is we used to all stand in the same lines, but now it's somewhat different. And to get back to the mission of Planet Word, the worst place this is happening is not in a commons or not in, how much health care do we get, but it is with our information commons. We used to have a media and information and ideas commons. We used to all know that's the way it is. We shared, even with different opinions, a common pool of information. But now we go to our different cul-de-sacs online, we dive down different rabbit holes on the internet, we all tune into different parts of the talk radio dial, and that technology that promised to connect us, they found a better business model in dividing us and enraging us. And so we have to figure out what were the causes of our great divide. I am either happy or sorry that Tom's not here, because one of the debates, sort of, that I've had with Tom, me and Michael Sandel, his Minnesota twin, with him, is the question of globalization. Just like Enclosure, the idea of globalization, of free trade, free movement of capital, free movement of people, it was told that that would increase the wealth of society. Well, that was right. It did. It enormously, in the past 40 years, increased the amount of wealth. However, what we didn't focus on is that globalization would hollow out a middle class, hollow out working class jobs, take my family in Bogalusa, Louisiana, who owned a furniture shop and a little timber mill or whatever, to be totally closed down so that they could go to Walmart on a Sunday night and really cheaply buy a Chinese-made flat-screen TV set, but in the morning they couldn't take the bus to the factory because all the jobs had been outsourced. We are starting to lose the American dream for many, many reasons, because of the information ecosystem, because of our politics, and partly because free trade delivered on its promise of more wealth, but we did not deliver on the policies that wealth would at least be distributed in ways that everybody got a chance to share in it. It was when I was born that on a single salary, my dad could have a house, a barbecue pit, 2 kids, a dog, a car. Nowadays, for our kids' generations, they can't even get a house. That when I turned 30, I was the exact median of my generation. Meaning when I turned 30, that's when 50% of people who turned 30 were able to buy a house, start forming a family, get married. That was 50% of people at age 30. It's now down to 14%. This is not that chart, but it's that 14% now of people, my daughter's generation, she's just turned 30, to be able to afford a home. This is why we have Mamdanis and Trumps and others, is this affordability. Secondly, When I was born in the 50s, you had an 80% chance that you would do better than your parents. In inflation-adjusted dollars, owning of homes, whatever metric you want, you had an 80% chance you would do better than your parents. If you were born in the 1980s or 1990s, that's less than a 50% chance. For the first time in American history, people have less of an opportunity, less of a chance to do better than their parents. That is a gut punch to what we mean by the American dream, that it's going to be a land of opportunity. And we worry about what's causing our political problems. Part of it is this deep issue, not with one particular solution, but the notion we've lost the common ground, we've lost the ability to create wealth but put things in commons, and we've lost the ability to make sure that the next generation are likely to do better than ours. Which leads to the final question is, what is the purpose of an economy? Now that might seem like a dumb question. And if you took Act 10, you probably, well, the purpose of an economy is to create wealth. It's to make more stuff. I think Jefferson would disagree. I think others would disagree that the purpose of the economy, they would say, is actually deeper than this. This is not a left-right issue. J.D. Vance and Orrin Cass write about this, as does Elizabeth Warren and so many others, that the purpose of economy is not just to create a total wealth that goes up, but it's to create a good society. It's to create a society based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's to create a society in which we all feel a part and in which democracy can work. That was the economy Jefferson was pushing and Hamilton was resisting, and that's the type of question we have to ask now of, is the purpose of the economy just to increase wealth, or is it to protect the commons, protect the common ground, and have a society that works? As I said, when they do the signature, it's the we all have to hang together. And that is what we should be spending the 250th thinking about. That's why I wrote the book. That's why Meacham has a book coming out. Ken Burns has. We're all trying to do it, which is what policies can we adopt? What balances can we craft that will strengthen the commons? You know, when we don't have universal military service, what type of institutions could create a shared sense of purpose in our society? What policies can we do that will give every kid an equal opportunity? Well, partly schools, but also healthcare, safe streets, whatever it may be. That should be our goal. And when it comes to words, what type of social media platforms and news outlets can we create? What type of personal conversations like this can we have? What algorithms that will connect us to common ground rather than inflame our resentments? It would help to look at the bust of Ben Franklin when you leave. He created the Academy for the Education of Youth. He created the library. He created the hospital. He created a Pennsylvania Gazette that had opinions from all sides, as opposed to being part of one party. And there at Independence Hall, he wrote the fundraising document for that hall on the right, the new hall, which was dedicated to providing a forum like this for any visiting preacher of the Great Enlightenment, of the Great Awakening, the preachers who were going around. And his fundraising document began by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, for we might learn something. And so when Dr. Franklin dies, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 preachers and priests linked arms with the rabbi of the Jews to march with him to the grave, with 20,000 people in the procession. That's what they were fighting for 250 years ago. That's still what we're fighting for today. Thank you all very much. Great. We have microphones that'll come around. I was told to speak for 45 minutes, and it's actually 2:46, so I think I hit my mark. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I've signed all the books, but if any of you don't have signed books, I'll do that and get to the airport. Go ahead.
90% of the channels are owned by conservative media right now. So where do you get unbridled truth?
First of all, there's no easy answer there. I've been involved in local media, like Verite in New Orleans and others, in which we try to have, from the ground up, local media that's going to cover things without doing. Secondly, we're in a bad problem with our information ecosystem where, even now, my old company CNN, heaven knows where it's going to end in this, and Trump will force it somewhere. Who knows? I think we all intentionally have to say, I'm going to find and use media that tries to unite us rather than divide us. I'm going to get off social media. For having written a book about Elon Musk, I was on Twitter and X for many, many years. And pretty much earlier this year, I decided, okay, I still want to know what's going on in different parts of the ecosystem, but I'll take all my social media apps and put them on the very last page of my phone. So I have to scroll all the way through to go to Facebook, TikTok, whatever. So maybe we all have to cut back on social media, and maybe we're in for a bad period because you're right. We have a free society in which people can buy media, and maybe a Bezos buys the Washington Post is good, and then maybe he buys it and you don't think it's good, whatever. But I don't have a simple solution except for start at home.
Such a delight to meet you, sir. There's probably 3 or 4 Gen Z members in this room. I have one. This is my creation. Any words of wisdom for Gen Z who's maybe taking AP U.S. history and learning about these primary documents? What would you say?
Well, first of all, history is really important. I teach at Tulane. I used to have parents who'd come in, I'm not sure I want my kid to major in history. They should major in coding. They should learn how to code. Well, let me tell you something. Anthropic codes better than they will ever code. But knowing human emotions throughout history and the values will be the most important thing we bring to the party. Secondly, I tell my students who are creating new companies, do what you asked, Pavita, which is try to find tools and digital tools that will bring us together, that will try to filter out some bad things. My daughter works for a very obscure outfit called Fix the News. And what it does is it curates and finds actual good news stories in science and technology and politics, and it serves it up each day to be an antidote to things. So I think each one of us can try to create new forms of enterprise that have as the goal, because sometimes my students say, I'm going to go join this company or that company or a hedge fund. I say, why? Oh, because I know I can make a lot of money. I said, yeah, but why? And after they told me a couple times they can make a lot of money and I still say, okay, why? They realize, well, what is the purpose of a life? Is it to maximize the amount of money you make, or is it to maximize the amount of good you do for society? So each generation has to do it, and I guess my generation should apologize to Generation Z for leaving them this bad.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacson. I just have a question. You probably all know David Brooks is leaving the New York Times to ask the very questions you're talking about. Mm-hmm. How can we reach beyond the converted, though, and try to bring us all together?
Well, I think David will be doing that. Ann is doing it, and Snyder, right? And what's David's wife's name? Who is, has a project trying to do it. It's difficult in these times because people get dug in, but I do think preaching only to the choir is a real mess. And even when people tell me I never go on X because it's just a cesspool of horrible people, I say, yeah, but somehow or another, we're going to have to understand what other people are saying. And this is where I got it wrong. I was on the side of globalization and free. I was part of the Davos-Aspen consensus. I said, well, let me think about why are people so resentful in Bogalusa or in Keokuk, Iowa, or whatever. And I say, okay, maybe they're not just terrible, horrible people who voted for Trump. Maybe they got left behind by a booming economy, and we have to figure it out. So instead of just trying to convince the other, we also have to, the fault, dear Brutus, may lie within ourselves sometimes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say I read a book a while ago called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, I think his surname is pronounced. It was very enlightening about differences in ideas about religion and politics. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to plug another author's book.
We love Jonathan, and by the way, his book on social media should be a Bible.
Yes. I had a couple questions about your process of writing this book. First, whether you discovered anything about the writing of the Declaration of Independence or the events surrounding it that you didn't know about before, and also were there any differences in researching a book about a document compared to researching a biography of a person?
Obviously, I found things I didn't know, including the editing of that sentence, and what do they mean by sacred, self-evident, and why did they say all men are created equal, and they knew darn well they weren't living up to that. So I was able to say, I get it, and I also learned that these were humans. They were flawed. These were not people carved in marble who were saints, especially Jefferson. And one of the complex things when you write biography is that sometimes people have some really bad streaks to them, and sometimes they have really good things like Jefferson did. And at first you say, I have to try to separate those two, admire them for the good things and be appalled at some of the bad things. But then the more complex thing is to realize those strands are interwoven. That is, Shakespeare, to quote him once again, said, even the best are molded out of faults. And that, to some extent, the passion, the blindness of an Elon or a Steve or of a Jefferson, you can't disentangle them. You have to treat them as humans. So writing the biography of a sentence, I was actually writing a biography of at least three men, Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. And I believe, unlike some academics, that history is made by individuals. They touch the surface and ripples happen. So I tried to write this very little book the way I wrote the very long Franklin book, which is to say, this isn't about forces and words and everything else. It's about people who put a real, quill onto a piece of paper. I mean, you can see it. And that piece of paper became our guiding principles. All right, one last question.
I'm curious what your opinion is of the efforts for like a wealth tax or a billionaire's tax. Is something imposed on them going to work, or do we have to train a generation of people to believe in the commons again?
I think we can all believe in the commons, and you might think a wealth tax isn't the most efficient way to do it, but then you can have things like property taxes, estate taxes and all, and say, you know what, we can afford for everybody to have health care. We can afford, if we want to in Manhattan, have free buses, if you're Mom Donnie. That's a policy choice. I'm not a tax expert to say what's the best way to do that tax, but I do think that Franklin, when he looked at the estate tax, let us say, he said, does that disincent people to make money, or does it disincent a new generation to have to be ambitious? And he said, no, the best thing to do is at least an estate tax. I think estate taxes, property taxes, others would be the way I would go. Let's real quickly do a couple. I didn't want to leave people out. I'll try to make shorter answers.
The 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s were just a tumultuous time. There were pirates, there were wars between major countries. I just learned that the tiny island of St. Lucia went back and forth between France and England for 13 different times.
Unfortunately for the cuisine, it ended up with England.
How did our country get these founding fathers? Were they the...
Well, what's a really interesting thing... Yeah, but they were flawed individuals, as I said, but they ended up together as a team forming greatness. And it wasn't inevitable, because it happens in France 10 years, 12 years later, and it doesn't end well. They're talking about the rights of man and stuff too. So they had people who understood science and the humanities and understood balance, meaning we did. And I think that was our secret sauce. In China right now, and I don't exalt China, but more than 50% of people in the Politburo and the ruling thing are engineers or scientists. In the United States, Congress and Senate, 0. They're all lawyers or whatever. They have one medical doctor in Bill Cassidy. But yeah, maybe it helps to know. And those of us who are historians and humanists, we say, oh, people should learn, as I said to the Gen Z people, you should learn, humanities and history. But those of us like humanities and history, we ought to learn science as well. We have to realize that science teaches us a balance.
Today, we have the people, we've got very talented, very smart people. I think, education is not a failure. It really isn't. We need to do better, but to echo her point, we had these brilliant, flawed men, but they understood balance. They were multidisciplinary, farming and science and everything else, and the way that politics is today, the microscope you have to go under, because everyone is flawed, I think keeps some of the better folks that say, I don't want them to find out, what I did when I was 25.
I think the problem is largely social media has exacerbated that. And nowadays, whether I'm in the public eye or anybody, they're going, take David Brooks, what you just talked about. All of a sudden, I'm reading people devastating him for, whatever it may be. I think we have to create, I'll end with this, if we need to create a new commons, it's got to be in the media. It's got to be a social media. It's got to be media that tries to make us empathetic and like each other more rather than hate each other. There's no formula to do that. But we get the type of media we want, and we should start wanting media that doesn't enrage us, but that unites us. Thank you all very much.